The gavel didn't fall, but her fate was sealed just the same. At 19, Rachel Higgins was traded for a pouch of gold dust and a gray mule to a man who hadn't spoken a word in a decade. Everyone said Lucien McCarty was a monster. They were dead wrong. The dusty, wind-battered town of Oak Haven, Colorado Territory was no place for a woman with a soft heart. And it was certainly no place for a 19-year-old girl whose father had a sickness for whiskey and faro. The year was 1887, and the biting November wind rattled the loose floorboards of the Red Dog Saloon, where Rachel's future was about to be auctioned off like a prized heifer. Rachel stood in the corner, her thin wool shawl pulled tightly around her trembling shoulders. Her father, Josiah Higgins, was sweating profusely, his trembling hands clutching a pair of losing cards. Across the table sat Arthur Pendleton, the wealthiest and most ruthless saloon owner in the county. Arthur was a man with a cold, calculating gaze and a reputation for breaking men's legs and spirits over a few misplaced dollars. Josiah owed Arthur $400. In Oak Haven, $400 might as well have been $4 million. "I don't have it, Arthur," Josiah stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. "But I'll get it. The silver mine up at Black Creek. I just need a week." "You don't have a week, Josiah," Arthur interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying drawl. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting slowly over to the corner where Rachel stood. "But I'm a reasonable man. I see an asset right there in the shadows. Your daughter. 19, strong, pretty enough if you wash the dirt off her face. Hand her over to me, and the debt is forgiven. She'll work off the rest upstairs." The saloon fell dead silent. The patrons, usually a loud and rowdy bunch of miners and drifters, stopped their drinking to watch. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. To go upstairs at the Red Dog meant a life of unspeakable misery. She looked at her father, expecting him to fight, to scream, to defend his only flesh and blood. Instead, Josiah looked down at his boots. Just wipe the slate clean? "Deal," Arthur smiled, a predatory gleam in his eye. He stood up, signaling two of his burly men to fetch Rachel. Rachel backed against the rough-hewn pine wall, her chest heaving. "No, Pa, please," she screamed, tears spilling over her lashes. But Josiah had already turned his back, shuffling toward the bar to drown his shame. As Arthur's men closed in, the swinging doors of the saloon burst open, letting in a violent howl of icy wind. The heavy thud of mud-caked boots against the floorboards brought everyone to a halt. It was Lucien McCarty. He was a giant of a man, standing well over 6 feet, wrapped in thick wolf pelts and a scarred leather duster. His thick, dark hair and heavy beard obscured much of his face, but a jagged, pale scar ran down his cheek, disappearing into his collar. Lucien lived high up on Dead Man's Ridge. He was known as the Silent Mountain Man, a hermit who came down only twice a year to trade furs for salt, coffee, and gunpowder. Rumor had it he was completely feral, a madman who had lost his voice after a grizzly tore his throat out. Others said he was an outlaw hiding from the Pinkertons. No one dared cross him. Lucien walked straight to the poker table, ignoring Arthur's men. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He didn't say a word. He simply reached inside his heavy coat, pulled out a thick, stained leather pouch, and slammed it onto the center of the poker table. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. Arthur Pendleton frowned, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of his revolver. "What's this, McCarty? I'm in the middle of business." Lucien didn't speak. He untied the leather strings and dumped the contents onto the green felt. A cascade of raw gold nuggets, heavy and dull in the lamplight, spilled out. It was easily worth double Josiah's debt. Lucien pointed a massive, calloused finger at the gold, then pointed at Rachel. The room gasped. The feral mountain man was buying her. Arthur's face twisted in rage, but he was a businessman first. He eyed the gold, doing the math in his head. "You want the girl?" Arthur sneered. "She ain't going to survive a week up on that ridge, McCarty. But gold is gold." Josiah, seeing a chance to clear his debt and perhaps pocket some leftover gold, scrambled forward. Now hold on, Lucien. She's my daughter. You want her? You marry her. I ain't having my family name dragged through the mud. It was a pathetic attempt to save face, but Lucien merely gave a short, curt nod. Within the hour, a terrified Rachel found herself standing in front of the town's terrified clergyman, Reverend Timothy Caldwell. The ceremony took place in the dusty street. Rachel was numb, her mind refusing to process the reality of her situation. She was married to a monster. When it was time to say their vows, Lucien said nothing. He only nodded. Reverend Caldwell hastily pronounced them man and wife, shoved a marriage certificate into Lucien's hand, and practically ran back into his church. Lucien turned to Rachel. Up close, he smelled of pine needles, wood smoke, and old leather. His dark eyes were unreadable. He grabbed her gently by the waist and hoisted her onto the back of his massive black draft horse, climbing up behind her. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut as the horse began to trot out of Oakhaven. She had escaped the devil in the saloon, only to be dragged into the freezing darkness by a demon of the mountains. The ride up Dead Man's Ridge was a grueling, agonizing journey into the clouds. As they ascended the steep, treacherous switchbacks, the temperature plummeted. Rachel shook violently, the thin fabric of her cotton dress offering no protection against the biting mountain wind. Without a word, Lucien stopped the horse. Rachel flinched, bracing herself for violence. Instead, Lucien unbuttoned his heavy, fleece-lined duster, took it off, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The coat was heavy, retaining his body heat, and immediately stopped her violent shivering. Lucien continued the ride in nothing but his canvas shirt and suspenders, seemingly impervious to the freezing cold. Rachel huddled inside the massive coat, confused. Why would a savage care if she froze? She wondered. Probably wants to keep his new property alive. It was well past midnight when they finally reached his home. Rachel had expected a squalid, drafty shack filled with rotting animal carcasses. When Lucien lifted her off the horse and opened the door, she was entirely caught off guard. The cabin was sturdy, built from massive, tightly fitted pine logs. Inside, it was remarkably clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main wall, and Lucien immediately struck a match, lighting a fire laid with seasoned oak. The room quickly bathed in a warm, golden glow. There was a solid oak table, a rocking chair, shelves lined with neatly organized provisions, and, in the corner, a large bed frame covered in thick, clean bear and deer skins. Rachel backed into the corner of the room, clutching the oversized duster around herself like a shield. This was it, the wedding night. She had heard the whispered horror stories from the older women in town about what men demanded of their wives, let alone a feral mountain man who had bought a woman with gold. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Lucien walked over to the wash basin. He poured water from a pitcher, grabbed a bar of lye soap, and began to scrub his massive hands and face. He dried off, then walked toward the small cast-iron stove to heat up a pot of stew that had been sitting on top. The aroma of venison and root vegetables filled the air, making Rachel's empty stomach clench in painful knots. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. Lucien ladled the stew into a tin bowl, cut a thick slice of crusty bread, and set it on the table. He turned to her, pointing at the food. Rachel didn't move. "I'm not hungry," she lied, her voice shaking. Lucien frowned. He pulled out a wooden chair, tapped the back of it, and gave her a look that left no room for argument. Slowly, terrified, Rachel crept to the table and sat down. She took a bite. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She practically inhaled the food. Lucien sat across from her, watching her eat, nursing a tin cup of black coffee. When she finished, the suffocating tension returned. Lucien stood up. He walked over to the large bed in the corner. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please let it be fast," she prayed silently. "Please." She heard the heavy rustle of blankets. When she opened her eyes, Lucien wasn't standing over her. He had taken 2 thick wool blankets from the bed and tossed them onto the braided rug in front of the hearth. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box, placing it on the table in front of her. Next to it, he laid the folded marriage certificate they had signed earlier that day. Rachel stared at the items, bewildered. She tentatively reached out and opened the wooden box. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, was a silver locket with a distinct engraving of a rose and a delicate gold wedding band. Rachel gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. "My mother's," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My father. He sold these when she died to pay for his drink. How do you have them?" Lucian reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small piece of charcoal and a folded, battered piece of paper. He leaned over the table and began to write in surprisingly neat, elegant script. When he was done, he slid the paper toward her. Rachel leaned in, reading the dark charcoal letters. "Your mother saved me in the blizzard of '79 when I was a boy. She found me freezing, hid me in your barn, and nursed me back to health when your father would have shot me for a trespasser. She told me to promise her I would look out for her little girl. The marriage paper is just to keep Arthur Pendleton away. You sleep in the bed, I take the floor. Come spring, when the passes thaw, I will buy you a train ticket anywhere you want to go. You are not a slave, Rachel. You are free." Rachel stared at the paper, reading the words over and over until they blurred through her tears. She looked up at the towering, silent mountain man sitting across from her. The man the whole town called a demon had traded his fortune not to own her, but to set her free. He stood up, gave her a respectful nod, and walked over to the fire, lying down on the hard floorboards with his back to her. Rachel sat by the dying firelight, clutching her mother's locket to her chest, realizing that everything she thought she knew about this world had just been shattered. Winter on Dead Man's Ridge was not merely a season. It was an absolute siege. By the second week of December, the snowdrifts had swallowed the lower half of the cabin, sealing Rachel and Lucien away from the rest of the world. In the beginning, the isolation was terrifying. Rachel spent her days flinching at the roaring wind, waiting for the massive, silent man to suddenly turn into the monster the town claimed him to be. But the monster never emerged. Instead, the brutal winter revealed a profound, unexpected domesticity. Lucien was a man of meticulous routine. He rose before the sun, breathing life into the banked embers of the hearth until the cabin was toasty and warm before Rachel even opened her eyes. He spent hours carving intricate wooden figurines, repairing his snowshoes, or reading from a surprisingly vast collection of leather-bound books stacked on a high shelf. He never asked her for anything. He never demanded she cook, clean, or mend his clothes. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, Rachel found herself taking over these chores, not out of obligation, but out of a quiet, growing desire to contribute to their shared survival. The oppressive silence between them slowly transformed into a comfortable language of its own. Rachel learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the slight softening of his dark eyes when she baked a successful batch of sourdough biscuits, the tense set of his broad shoulders when a blizzard battered the roof, the gentle, lingering way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The turning point came in late February, during a week-long whiteout that kept them entirely indoors. Lucien had gone down into the root cellar beneath the floorboards to fetch a sack of potatoes, leaving his heavy leather duster draped over the back of his chair. As Rachel swept the pine floors, she accidentally knocked the coat over. A heavy iron key slipped from the pocket and clattered loudly against the floorboards. Rachel froze. She stared at the key. For months, she had noticed a large, iron-bound chest pushed deep beneath the bed, heavily padlocked. Lucien had never forbidden her from touching it, but the padlock was a clear boundary. Human curiosity, amplified by months of isolation, finally overpowered her sense of propriety. With trembling hands, she took the key, knelt beside the bed, and slid the heavy chest out. The key turned in the lock with a heavy click. Rachel lifted the lid, expecting to find pelts, extra ammunition, or perhaps stolen loot from the raids the townspeople accused him of. Instead, the chest was filled with perfectly organized stacks of paper, bound ledgers, and a neatly folded uniform made of fine navy wool. Resting on top of the uniform was a polished silver star. Rachel picked it up, wiping away the dust. The engraved words sent a shockwave through her chest. Pinkerton National Detective Agency, Agent Lucien Montgomery. Montgomery, she whispered to the empty room. He wasn't a feral hermit. He was a lawman. Frantically, she dug deeper. She found a leather-bound journal and flipped it open. The pages were filled with Lucien's elegant handwriting, detailing a 2-year undercover operation in Denver. He had been tracking a highly organized gang of train robbers responsible for the Great Central Pacific Heist, a robbery that had resulted in the theft of over $100,000 in raw gold. Rachel's breath hitched as she found a newspaper clipping tucked between the pages. The headline screamed, "Agent Montgomery presumed dead in train yard ambush. Gold still missing." Beneath the clipping was a crude hand-drawn map of Oakhaven, with specific buildings circled in red ink. The Red Dog Saloon was circled twice. And beside it, a name was written in heavy, angry charcoal. Arthur Pendleton. The pieces slammed together in her mind with terrifying clarity. Lucien hadn't lost his voice to a bear. The jagged, terrible scar on his throat was the work of a man's blade. Arthur Pendleton hadn't just been a saloon owner. He was the mastermind behind the heist. He had tried to execute Lucien and made off with the gold, using it to build his empire in Oakhaven. Lucien wasn't hiding on the mountain because he was a savage. He was biding his time, gathering evidence, and systematically hunting down the men who had betrayed him. The gold he had dropped on the poker table to buy her wasn't mined from the hills. It was Pendleton's own stolen gold, recovered by Lucien from one of the gang's dead drop locations. The heavy thud of the cellar door slamming shut jolted Rachel out of her shock. She spun around, dropping the journal. Lucien stood in the center of the room, a sack of potatoes in his hand. He looked at the open chest, the silver badge clutched in her hand, and the scattered papers. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with the weight of a deadly secret laid bare. Rachel scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She expected anger. She expected him to lunge across the room and silence her. Instead, Lucien slowly set the sack down. He walked toward her, his face an unreadable mask of stoicism. He reached out, but not for her throat. He gently took the silver badge from her trembling fingers, looking down at it with a mixture of profound sorrow and simmering rage. He pointed to the newspaper clipping, then pointed to the jagged scar on his neck. He held up his hands, mimicking the act of someone sneaking up from behind and dragging a blade across his throat. Then, he pointed to the name on the map. Arthur Pendleton. "He did this to you," Rachel breathed, tears springing to her eyes. "He tried to kill you." Lucien gave a single, slow nod. "And the gold," she stammered, pointing toward Oakhaven. "You used his own stolen money to get me out of that saloon." Another nod. Lucien walked over to the table, grabbed his charcoal pencil, and wrote quickly on a scrap of paper. He handed it to her. "I am a dead man, Rachel. If Pendleton knows I am alive, he will send an army up this mountain. I couldn't let him take you upstairs that night. Your mother saved my life when I was a boy. I owed her a debt, but now you know the truth. This cabin is not a home. It is a fortress, and the war is coming." Rachel looked from the note to the towering man before her. The town of Oakhaven thought they had sold a helpless girl to a monster. They didn't know they had handed her over to the most honorable man in the territory. "Then let it come," Rachel said, her voice steadying. She walked past him to the hearth, tossing the scrap of paper into the flames. She turned back to face him, lifting her chin with a fierce, newfound resolve. "My father sold me. The town, let him do it. You are the only person who has ever shown me a shred of decency, Lucien Montgomery. If there's a war coming, I'm fighting it with you." For the first time since she had met him, the corners of Lucien's eyes crinkled. He didn't smile, but a profound warmth radiated from his gaze. He reached out and gently rested his massive, calloused hand against her cheek. It was a fleeting, tender gesture that spoke 1,000 words he could never say. Spring arrived not with a gentle bloom, but with a violent thaw. The snowpack on Dead Man's Ridge began to melt, sending rushing torrents of icy water down the mountainside. The passes were clearing. The isolation that had protected them for 5 months was dissolving, leaving them exposed to the valley below. It was the first week of April when Lucien placed a heavy canvas pouch and a crisp, freshly printed train ticket on the table. The ticket was stamped for San Francisco, as far away from the Colorado territory as the rails could take a person. Lucien tapped the ticket, looking at Rachel. He was dressed in his heavy duster, a pair of Colt peacemakers strapped to his thighs, a Winchester repeating rifle slung over his shoulder. He was preparing for a fight, and he was clearing the battlefield. Rachel stood at the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand. She stared at the ticket, then looked up at him. Over the winter, the frail, terrified girl who had been auctioned off in a saloon had vanished. Her face was tanned from the high-altitude sun, her hands calloused from chopping kindling, her posture straight and defiant. She walked to the table, picked up the train ticket, and without breaking eye contact with him, walked over to the roaring hearth. She dropped the ticket directly onto the red-hot coals. It curled, blackened, and burst into bright orange flames. Lucien stepped forward, his eyes wide in silent protest. He grabbed her arm, pointing frantically at the burning paper, then pointing down the mountain. "I told you in February," Rachel said firmly, pulling her arm away. "I am not leaving. You promised my mother you'd look out for me. Well, you did. Now it's my turn to look out for you." She walked over to the weapons rack by the door and pulled down a sleek, well-oiled Marlin lever-action rifle he had taught her to shoot during the winter. She checked the chamber with a satisfying metallic clack. "Arthur Pendleton is going to kill you if you fight him alone. You need someone watching your back." Lucien stared at her, a mixture of frustration, awe, and deep, undeniable affection warring on his scarred face. He closed his eyes, let out a heavy sigh through his nose, and finally gave a sharp nod. He reached into a drawer and tossed her 2 boxes of 44-40 cartridges. They didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, the trap was sprung. Arthur Pendleton was many things, but he wasn't a fool. When the spring assayers made their rounds in Oakhaven, the banker had noted the peculiar, crude stamped marks on the gold nuggets Lucien had used to pay Josiah Higgins's debt. They matched the exact stamps of the gold stolen in the Great Central Pacific heist. Arthur knew immediately that the feral mountain man was no hermit. He was a ghost from the train yard. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the blue jays in the surrounding pines suddenly went dead silent. Lucien, who had been chopping wood near the tree line, dropped his axe. He signaled to Rachel, who was hanging laundry on the line. "Inside. Now." Rachel dropped the damp linen and sprinted for the heavy oak door. Lucien followed right on her heels. The moment the heavy iron bolt slid into place, the sharp, cracking report of a rifle echoed through the valley. A bullet tore through the front window, shattering the glass and embedding itself deep into the stone of the fireplace. "Get down!" Rachel screamed, though she didn't need to tell him. Lucien was already moving with lethal, calculated precision. He overturned the heavy oak dining table, creating a barricade, and dragged Rachel behind it. Outside, the thunder of hooves grew louder. Through the shattered window, Rachel could see them pouring out of the tree line, 8 heavily armed men, their faces tied with bandanas. Leading the pack, sitting atop a magnificent roan stallion, was Arthur Pendleton. "Well, well, well." Arthur's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rocky ridge. "I thought I recognized the eyes on that beast when you walked into my saloon. Took a lot of nerve to spend my own gold in my own town, Montgomery. I should have cut your head clean off 5 years ago." Lucien didn't waste a bullet on an answer. He rested the barrel of his Winchester on the edge of the overturned table, sighted a man trying to flank the cabin on the left, and pulled the trigger. The man dropped like a stone. The clearing erupted into absolute chaos. A hail of lead rained down on the cabin, bullets chewed through the pine logs, sending deadly splinters of wood flying through the air. The noise was deafening, a relentless percussion of violence. Rachel pressed her back against the table, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands slick with sweat as she gripped the Marlin rifle. "Burn them out!" Arthur roared from the safety of the tree line. "I want him alive so I can finish the job. But I don't care if the girl burns." 2 men broke from the cover of the pines, carrying torches made of pitch-soaked rags. They sprinted toward the rear of the cabin, aiming for the dry woodpile stacked against the back wall. Lucien was pinned down by suppressing fire from the front, unable to get an angle on the men in the back. He looked at Rachel, panic flashing in his dark eyes for the first time. Rachel didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the floor on her stomach, ignoring the bullets whizzing inches above her head, until she reached the small window near the kitchen stove. She pushed herself up onto her knees, rested the rifle on the windowsill, and took a breath, letting the chaotic noise of the gunfight fade to a dull hum. She remembered Lucien's silent instruction from the winter. Breathe out. Squeeze. Don't jerk. She exhaled. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder. The first man running with a torch cried out, dropping his weapon and grabbing his leg as he collapsed into the mud. The second man hesitated, turning back in shock. Rachel chambered another round with lightning speed and fired again, grazing his shoulder. The man dropped the torch in the snow and scrambled back toward the trees like a terrified rabbit. Lucien looked over his shoulder at her, offering a grim, blood-pumping nod of approval. But the battle was far from over. Arthur Pendleton was losing patience. "Rush the door," he commanded. "All of you, hit the door." 5 men charged at once. Lucien fired rapidly, taking down 2, but 3 made it to the porch. They began battering the heavy oak door with the butts of their rifles. The iron hinges groaned under the assault. The wood began to splinter. Lucien dropped his empty rifle and drew his twin Colts. He positioned himself directly in front of the door, his massive frame shielding Rachel. He was ready to die fighting. With a deafening crack, the door gave way, bursting inward. But before Lucien could fire, a massive, deafening explosion rocked the entire mountainside. The ground beneath the cabin violently shuddered. The 3 men on the porch were thrown backward by a concussive wave of heat and dirt. Rachel covered her ears, screaming as a thick cloud of black smoke and debris washed over the front of the cabin, instantly blinding everyone in the clearing. Arthur Pendleton's horse reared back, screaming in terror. Rachel coughed violently, waving the dust from her face. She looked at Lucien, bewildered. Lucien calmly holstered one of his revolvers, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small brass detonator. He had wired the front porch and the approach path with mining dynamite months ago, burying it beneath the frost line. The smoke began to clear. Pendleton's surviving men were groaning on the ground, concussed and bleeding, their fight entirely broken. Arthur was struggling to control his terrified horse, his pristine suit covered in mud and ash. Lucien stepped out onto the ruined porch, the smoke swirling around his massive, imposing figure. He leveled his Colt directly at Arthur Pendleton's chest. The hammer clicked back with a menacing, final sound that echoed across the quiet mountain. The feral mountain man had won the siege, but as Arthur stared down the barrel of the gun, a sick, twisted smile spread across his bloodied face. He slowly reached into his coat with 2 fingers and pulled out a heavy, intricately carved wooden box. Rachel gasped from the doorway. It was the box containing her mother's locket and wedding band. She had left it on the clothesline when the shooting started. "Go ahead and shoot, Montgomery," Arthur spat, tossing the box up and catching it. "But if I don't ride back into Oak Haven by sundown, my men have orders to burn Josiah Higgins alive in the town square. You might not care about the old drunk, but I'm betting the little bride behind you does." Lucien froze. His finger hovered over the trigger. He looked back at Rachel, the agonizing weight of an impossible choice descending upon them. Lucien lowered his Colt. The heavy iron barrel dipped slowly toward the muddy earth. Rachel let out a choked breath, leaning against the splintered doorframe. Her father had traded her like livestock to save his own skin, but the thought of him burning alive in the town square was a horror she couldn't bear. Arthur barked a cruel, victorious laugh. "That's what I thought, Montgomery. You were always a soft-hearted fool." He pocketed the wooden box containing Rachel's family heirlooms. "I'll be taking my gold now. Have the girl loaded onto my pack mules." Lucien didn't move. He didn't lower his gaze. Instead, the scarred corners of his mouth twitched upward into a cold, terrifying smirk. He reached into his duster, but not for a weapon. He pulled out a heavy brass pocket watch, clicked it open, and checked the time. It was exactly high noon. Before Arthur could process the strange gesture, the shrill, piercing blast of a train whistle echoed up from the valley below, cutting through the thin mountain air. It wasn't the regular commercial supply train. It was a specialized locomotive, blowing a continuous, frantic distress signal, the prearranged, unmistakable code of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Arthur's horse skittered nervously. The saloon owner wheeled around in his saddle, squinting down the treacherous switchback trail. Through the clearing smoke, a massive posse of riders broke through the timberline. There were at least 40 of them, armed with Winchester repeating rifles and riding hard. At the front of the formation rode a stout, impeccably dressed man in a bowler hat and a thick mustache, William A. Pinkerton himself, the legendary co-director of the agency. Lucien hadn't just been waiting out the winter, chopping wood. Back in January, during a brief, brutal break in the snowstorms, he had crossed the treacherous western ridge on snowshoes to drop a coded telegraph at the remote junction station. He had forwarded the stolen ledgers, the map of the dead drops, and Arthur's exact location directly to the agency's Chicago headquarters. Lucien had orchestrated this exact standoff.
"You're too late, Pendleton!"
William Pinkerton roared as his horse slid to a halt in the muddy clearing. His men instantly fanned out, leveling their rifles at Arthur and his surviving thugs. "Your men in Oakhaven are already in irons, and Josiah Higgins is sleeping off a hangover in my custody." Arthur's face drained of color. The empire he had built on stolen gold and blood was crumbling in seconds. Panic seized him. In a desperate, final act of madness, Arthur reached for the revolver, tucked in his shoulder holster. He never even cleared the leather. Lucien moved with blinding speed. He didn't fire the Colt in his hand. He threw a heavy, perfectly balanced hunting knife he'd drawn from his belt. The steel blade flashed in the midday sun and embedded itself deep into Arthur's right shoulder. Arthur screamed, tumbling backward off his roan stallion and hitting the mud with a sickening thud. The wooden box flew from his coat pocket, landing softly in the melting snow. The Pinkerton agents swarmed the clearing, disarming the wounded men and slapping heavy iron cuffs on Arthur Pendleton's wrists. William Pinkerton dismounted, walking deliberately over to Lucien. The legendary detective took off his bowler hat, a look of profound respect washing over his weathered face. "It's damn good to see you alive, Agent Montgomery," William said, clasping Lucien's massive shoulder. "The agency owes you a debt that money can't repay. We have the gold. We have the men. Your watch is officially over." Lucien gave a slow, respectful nod. He turned away from the commotion and walked over to the snowbank. He knelt down, picked up the carved wooden box, and carefully wiped the mud from it. He walked back to the ruined porch where Rachel stood trembling. He placed the box gently into her hands. Then, Lucien reached up and touched the terrible, jagged scar on his throat. He cleared his throat, a harsh, painful sound that made Rachel flinch. He looked deeply into her eyes, his chest heaving with the weight of 5 silent years. Lucien started. His voice was a ruined, gravelly rasp, barely more than a whisper. But to Rachel, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. "I am free." Tears spilled over Rachel's lashes. She dropped her rifle and threw her arms around his massive neck, burying her face in his chest. Lucien wrapped his strong arms around her, holding her as if she were the only real thing left in the world. 3 months later, the town of Oakhaven was a different place. The corruption had been entirely rooted out by the federal marshals. As for Lucien and Rachel, they didn't take the train to San Francisco. With the substantial reward money and back pay from the Pinkerton agency, they bought a sprawling, beautiful piece of land in the valley, right at the base of Dead Man's Ridge. They built a new cabin, far away from the shadows of the past. Lucien never regained his full voice, speaking only in quiet, raspy whispers. But their home was never silent. It was filled with the sounds of a crackling hearth, the clinking of Rachel's sourdough bowls, and eventually, the joyous laughter of their children echoing across the frontier. The feral mountain man and his bought bride had found the greatest treasure of the Wild West, a love that could survive the deepest winter. Did the silent mountain man's ultimate sacrifice and Rachel's bravery steal your heart? If you loved this Wild West romance and its thrilling twists, smash that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical dramas and true-to-life frontier stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale. What was your favorite moment? Comment below.